There is a letter written on a clay tablet that was never delivered. It was found in the ruins of Ugarit, a wealthy trading city on the coast of what is now Syria. The tablet was still in the kiln where it had been fired, waiting to dry when the city burned down around it. The king of Ugarit had written to a neighboring ruler. He said that enemy ships had been sighted, that his own fleet was away in Lycia, that his army was away in Hittite territory, that the city was undefended. He asked what he should do. Nobody ever answered. Ugarit was destroyed, and it was never rebuilt. The tablet sat in the ashes for 3,000 years, and Ugarit was not alone. Within roughly 50 years, on either side of the year 1177 BC, almost every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean stopped existing. Not declined, stopped. This is what happened. And why, after a century of excavation, we still cannot agree on the cause. To understand the scale of what was lost, you need to understand what was there. In the 13th century BC, the Eastern Mediterranean was more connected than it would be again for a very long time. There was Egypt at the height of the New Kingdom, the Egypt of Rameses II, of Karnak, of monumental construction on a scale that still defines what people picture when they think of ancient Egypt. There was the Hittite Empire in what is now Turkey, a military power that had fought Egypt to a standstill and then signed what is often called the first surviving international peace treaty. There were the Mycenaeans in mainland Greece, the world that produced the palaces at Mycenae and Pylos, and the legends that would later become the Iliad. There was Assyria. There was Babylon. There was Cyprus, controlling the copper trade. There was Ugarit, one of the great ports of the age, and crucially, these were not isolated kingdoms. They traded constantly. They exchanged letters, gifts, and royal marriages. Egyptian records, Hittite archives, and clay tablets from a dozen cities describe a network of diplomacy that spanned the entire region. We know this because the letters survive. There is a shipwreck off the coast of Turkey at a place called Uluburun that sank around 1300 BC. What was on board tells you everything about how connected this world was. Copper ingots from Cyprus, tin from further east, glass ingots, ebony from Africa, ivory, pottery from Mycenae, from Canaan, from Egypt, objects from at least 7 different cultures in a single ship's hold. That is the world. A dense, wealthy, interdependent trading system held together by long-distance exchange of raw materials and manufactured goods. And that interdependence, some researchers argue, is precisely why it fell apart so completely. Kiri, here's what the archaeology shows. Across the eastern Mediterranean in the decades around 1200 BC, city after city shows a destruction layer, a band of ash and rubble in the excavation record marking the moment the settlement burned or was abandoned. The Hittite capital, Hattusa, was abandoned and burned. The empire that had rivaled Egypt disappeared entirely from the historical record. It would not be rediscovered until the 20th century when archaeologists began excavating a site Turkish villagers had known about, but nobody had identified. The Mycenaean palaces were destroyed. Pylos burned. Mycenae was damaged and never fully recovered. And with the palaces went the administrative system that ran them, including writing. The Mycenaean script, which we call Linear B, simply stops appearing. Greece would not have a written script again for roughly 400 years. Ugarit was destroyed and never reoccupied. The great trading cities of the Levantine coast were burned one after another. Egypt survived, but barely and not intact. The New Kingdom went into a decline it never reversed. Central authority weakened. Egyptian control over the Levant vanished. Consider the scale of that. Across an entire region, within roughly 2 generations, cities burned, empires dissolved, trade networks severed, and in some places, literacy itself lost. Archaeologists sometimes describe what followed as a dark age, a period where the material record thins out dramatically. Fewer sites, smaller settlements, less trade goods, simpler pottery, fewer of the things that indicate a complex society functioning. The question that has occupied researchers for a century is straightforward to ask and apparently impossible to answer. Why? There are several explanations, and each has strong evidence behind it. That is exactly the problem. The first is invasion. Egyptian records describe attacks by groups they called the Sea Peoples. Inscriptions at Medinet Habu from the reign of Ramesses III describe a coalition of foreign peoples arriving by land and sea, destroying everything in their path and being defeated by Egyptian forces. The inscriptions name several groups. The problem is that we do not reliably know who any of them were. Their origin is disputed. Their composition is disputed. Whether they were a coordinated invasion force or a symptom of collapse elsewhere is disputed. They are the most famous explanation and among the least understood. The second is earthquakes. The eastern Mediterranean sits on active fault systems. Some researchers have proposed what is sometimes called an earthquake storm, a sequence of major seismic events over several decades as stress transfers along a fault system. Several destroyed sites show damage patterns consistent with earthquakes rather than warfare. Collapsed walls falling in a single direction, bodies crushed under masonry rather than showing weapon injuries. But earthquakes destroy buildings. They do not usually destroy civilizations. Societies rebuild. The third is climate. This is where the evidence has grown strongest in recent decades. Pollen cores, isotope records, and sediment analysis from across the region point toward a period of significant drought beginning in the late 13th century BC and continuing for a considerable time. There are textual hints, too. Hittite records mention grain shipments arriving from Egypt. An Egyptian source describes sending grain to keep the Hittites alive. When one empire is feeding another, something has gone wrong with the harvest. A prolonged drought in an agricultural society is not an inconvenience. It is a slow-motion catastrophe. Failed harvests, food shortages, population movement, and eventually social breakdown. The fourth is internal rebellion. The Mycenaean palaces were highly centralized, redistributive economies. The palace collected agricultural surplus and redistributed it. That works when there is a surplus. When there is not, the system has no function, and the people supporting it have no reason to keep supporting it. Some researchers have suggested the palaces were destroyed from within. The fifth is systems collapse, and this is where the modern consensus, to the extent one exists, has settled. The argument is that none of these causes is sufficient on its own, but that they did not occur on their own. Think about what the Uluburun shipwreck represents. Copper from one place, tin from another, both required to make bronze, which is the metal this entire era is named for. Bronze requires long-distance trade by definition. The ingredients do not occur together. So a civilization dependent on bronze is a civilization dependent on international shipping. Break the shipping and you break the metal supply. Break the metal supply and you break the tools, the weapons, and the economy built on them. Now stack the failures. Drought reduces harvests. Reduced harvests mean less surplus to trade and hungry populations. Hungry populations move or revolt. Movement and unrest make trade routes dangerous. Dangerous routes reduce trade further. Reduced trade means less metal, less grain, less of everything that held the system together. Add earthquakes damaging key cities during this. Add raiders exploiting weakened defenses. Add central administrations that cannot solve any of it, losing the legitimacy that kept them in power. Each failure makes the others worse. And because these societies were so tightly interconnected, failure in one place propagated outward. The specialists call this systems collapse, a tightly coupled network in which local failures cascade because there is no slack anywhere in the system. The connectivity that made this world rich is the same connectivity that let it fail all at once. It is worth being clear that this remains a model, not a proven sequence. The evidence for drought is strong. The evidence for destruction is unambiguous. The precise chain of causation and how much weight each factor carries is still argued about in the literature. What is not argued about is that it happened. The aftermath lasted centuries. In Greece, the population declined sharply, settlements shrank, long-distance trade contracted, monumental construction stopped, and writing disappeared entirely. Linear B vanishes with the palace system that used it, and Greece is without a script until the alphabet arrives from Phoenicia around the 8th century BC. That gap is why the Homeric epics matter so much. The Iliad and the Odyssey describe the Mycenaean world, but they were written down centuries after that world had ended, having been carried through the intervening period as oral poetry. They are memories of a lost age, transmitted by people who no longer had the means to write them down at the time. Not everything was destroyed, though. Cyprus recovered relatively quickly. Some Phoenician cities came through and went on to dominate Mediterranean trade for centuries afterward, spreading the alphabet as they went. And the collapse cleared space. The kingdoms that emerged afterwards, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Greek city-states, the world that produced classical antiquity, grew in the gap the Bronze Age left. There is also a technological shift. Ironworking spread significantly in the period following the collapse. Whether that was cause or consequence is debated. Iron ore is far more widely available than the tin and copper combination bronze requires, so a world with broken trade routes has good reason to develop an alternative. A civilization does not necessarily choose iron because it is better. It may choose iron because it can no longer get tin. The thing that unsettles people about the Bronze Age collapse is not that it happened. Civilizations end. That is the normal course of history. It is that it happened to all of them at roughly the same time, and that after a century of excavation, we still cannot say with confidence why. We have the destruction layers. We have the climate data. We have the Egyptian inscriptions and the Hittite archives and the letters from Ugarit that were never sent. We have more evidence about this collapse than about almost any other event of comparable age, and it is still not enough to settle the argument. That should probably tell us something about how hard it is to explain the end of a complex society. Even with the ruins in front of us, even with the writing preserved, even with 3,000 years to think about it. The king of Ugarit wrote his letter asking what to do. The tablet was still in the kiln when the city burned. He never got an answer either. If you want more of these, subscribe. There is a new one every week, and if you want the story of an entire city that vanished underwater and stayed lost for over 1,000 years, watch the video on Thonis Heraclean next.